Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Gladstone, and I'm the very proud Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Thursdays at 3 with our curator, Jaqueline Goldstein. Today, she'll be speaking with Paul Roth, who is an expert on the photography of Avedon, and most specifically about his photographs of the Chicago 7, which I was very excited to learn existed in an article in the New York Times. So it's a very exciting subject for us. But before I turn the program over to the two of them, please allow me a moment to do a little bit of museum discussion. So first of all, I'm going to brag, but we're very excited that Miami New Times, in their latest edition of the Best of Everything in Miami, has selected the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, as the best museum in Miami. And we are a small but mighty museum, and we feel a little bit like the David and the Goliath story, but we are absolutely thrilled. And we're very happy that all of you are joining us today, because it's because of this kind of programming during this pandemic and some of the other things we've been doing that I believe has led us to get this designation. So secondly, we are at the very tail end of a virtual fundraising effort called Heritage Heroes. It's our 25th anniversary, and we have been raising funds in honor of this anniversary. And I'm going to have Nancy put the direct website address, the link, into the chat. And if you enjoy your afternoon with us today and you are not already a member or have not already donated to our fundraising effort, I would encourage you to please do so. It's only with the support of all of our friends and fans and members that we're able to provide you with this kind of wonderful programming. So having said all of that, I'm going to sit back and enjoy the program, and I'm going to turn it over to our curator, Jaqueline Goldstein.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much, Susan. Today we have a very special guest, Paul Roth. A little bit about Mr. Roth, if I may. First of all, thank you for joining us today. And here we go. Paul Roth previously served as Senior Curator and Director of Photography and Media Arts at the Corcoran in DC, and also served as Executive Director of the Richard Avedon Foundation. Mr. Roth specializes in contemporary and 20th century American photography, and currently is the Director of the Ryerson Image Foundation Center in Toronto. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am so happy to be here. Thank you, Jaqueline. Thank you, Susan. I was so happy to get this request to come and talk to you about Richard Avedon, a great photographer, a great portrait photographer, a great Jewish American photographer, and somebody who has been a subject of obsession for me for many, many years now. So I really do appreciate the invitation. I'm very happy to be speaking to all of you today in this wonderful new arena that we've all discovered recently, Zoom land. It's really fantastic to be able to see people from all over the country here. I am coming from the snowy environs of Toronto, Ontario in Canada, but I have not lost my obsession with Richard Avedon up here. And the subject of today's talk is one of great interest to me because it's a portrait that Richard Avedon made that's quite complex, and it's a fascinating story how it came to be. But it is also a picture that is a bit anomalous in the career of Richard Avedon. And I know that some of you will probably have more knowledge about Avedon than some others of you do have. So I'm going to try to bring a little bit of that context to bear. It's also a great moment to talk about this picture because a couple of things have happened recently to bring the subject matter of the Chicago 7 much more into the foreground. And one of those, for those of you who know about it, some of you may have already seen it, there is a drama on Netflix about the trial of the Chicago 7, written and directed by Aaron Sorkin. I just saw it. It's so funny, it's fascinating, and I highly recommend that you watch it if you want to know about the political and historical context for the image that we're about to look at. But in addition, there's also very recently a biography of Richard Avedon that deals with his whole life, but as well about this particular subject and the period of photography that this image comes out of. The photograph that we're going to be looking at, and I'm going to share my screen with you right now so you can all see the slideshow that I'll be talking about. The photograph that we will be talking about, and my goodness, we're all the way back far. I'm into the slideshow. I'm sorry for my first technical difficulty. Let's get right back to the beginning. It was made in 1969, and this photograph was actually the outcome of a series of steps that were made and a kind of evolution of style that defined a new period in Richard Avedon's career. He was in effect reinventing himself, because the truth is Richard Avedon was a great photographer in many different ways. And a lot of people may know one aspect about Avedon, but not another. This photograph is a very critical moment in his career. It represents the changing of his style and the beginning of a new and much more interesting and deep way, I think, of making portraits. But most people, of course, know Richard Avedon not as a portraitist, but as a fashion photographer. And so we start there in the 1940s, when Richard Avedon became almost immediately upon the beginning of his mature career as a professional photographer, quite famous. He became a fashion photographer for Harper's Bazaar magazine in the 1940s. He had just learned how to be a photographer by making portraits in the Merchant Marine at the very end of World War II. And his rise in New York City at Harper's Bazaar was meteoric. He became a superstar. He is pivotally important in the history of fashion photography for creating a new style, but also for reinventing how we think about fashion, more broadly speaking. He was actually charged at Harper's Bazaar by his editor, the great Carmel Snow, with changing people's thinking about Paris during the post-war period, reinventing the idea of Paris through his photographs. And so images like this one, and this one, his most famous fashion photograph, a picture of Dovima, the model with elephants, were absolutely critical for reinventing the kind of consumerist ethos around fashion in the wake of World War II. Of course, Paris during the 1940s and 1950s was actually recovering from the economic shocks in the post-war period, and getting fashion back off the ground was one of the central missions of Harper's Bazaar. Richard Avedon was the critical tool in that mission. And so his photographs essentially took people into the streets and invested fashion with the life of Paris. They recreated the idea of Paris as a never-ending party. And he also humanized the models as people, as women, therefore allowing the readers of magazines like Harper's Bazaar to identify with a beautiful model, yes, but a model with a double chin. This was revolutionary at the time. And even in his most glamorous images, like this one of Dovima with the elephants, he was able to change our understanding of glamour, essentially to create an idea of glamour that was so aspirational and yet at the same time so relatable that people could start to look at their magazines when Harper's Bazaar would arrive in your home and have an idea of what the better life was like, what it looked like, whether it was in New York City or in Paris or in another exotic locale. Avedon, as I said, was very famous, and by the 1950s, he was regularly profiled in newspapers and magazines. And in fact, he got the ultimate kind of credibility in mainstream America by being the thinly fictionalized subject of the movie Funny Face, along with Audrey Hepburn. There are a lot of people who don't realize that Fred Astaire's character was named Dick Avery, very much like Richard Avedon, Dick Avedon, that Fred Astaire was loosely modeled on the career and the glamour and the success and fame of Richard Avedon. And Avedon was involved in the making of the film in a variety of ways. Most of the photographs that you actually see by the Dick Avery character were made by Avedon. And you see him here with Fred Astaire in Paris during the shooting of the film. So this identification of Avedon with glamour essentially changed how people thought about Avedon as much as it changed how people thought about fashion. And as the years went on, he became more and more sophisticated in his approaches, knowing that when people would open Harper's Bazaar, they would be looking for the Avedon photographs, and they would wonder, what is it that Richard Avedon did this month that's going to get my attention and that's going to make me laugh and smile? And images like this one by the early 1960s were as radical as any fashion photographs anyone had seen before. This is essentially a setup scene that shows what it's like at a fashion show. And it's satirical, it's hilarious, but it's also very strange, and it's chaotic and anarchic. Avedon became more and more capable as a studio photographer, more and more capable of telling a story within the frame as the years went on. By the late 1960s, he switched from Harper's Bazaar magazine to Vogue magazine, and he also switched with the times. And as the style started to turn more in the trends that were coming from London, from Carnaby Street, and from the people who were following the Beatles and reinventing an idea of youth glamour, as things became more dynamic, as new dancing styles spread through youth culture, Avedon kept pace with the times, as you can see here in a series of studio photographs. And his photographs, just as they had defined the 1940s and the 1950s, began to define the 1950s and how people saw fashion through the pages of the magazine at that time. And the reason why I'm leaving fashion right now is because we're coming up to that present moment when Avedon made the photographs of the Chicago 7. But it's important to know another thing about him in order to switch gears and to look at that moment. And that is that at the same time that Richard Avedon was changing and redefining fashion photography, he was also the best known editorial portrait photographer in the American magazine world. He was celebrated as much for his portraits made for magazines like Theater Arts and Harper's Bazaar, and then ultimately Vogue, as for his fashion pictures. And you can see that here. Here he is with his twin lens Rolleiflex, posing for a self-portrait. And there's an image of him working here, making images to promote the movie Guys and Dolls, photographing Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra. And you can see him at work, communicating with his subjects. There are so many photographs I could show you here, and obviously we don't have time. But here are just a few of the pictures that made his reputation and that helped to define him as the definitive portrait photographer of his era, the person who was most adept at showing the public who it is that they were following in the news, the private lives, the personal faces, and the personas, the theatricalized figures of the superstars of politics, of music, of acting, and many, many other professions. This image of Charlie Chaplin in the 1950s is very famous. He made beautiful and soulful portraits of artists like Alberto Giacometti. This incredible, extraordinary image of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, which he famously made with great difficulty. The Duke and Duchess were giving him their very practiced faces, their very smooth faces that they used whenever they were being photographed. And Avedon wanted something more than that. He wanted some tension in the image. He wanted some drama in the faces of the Duke and Duchess. And so he actually lied to them, told them that on the way to the sitting, that he was in a taxi and that the taxi he was riding in hit a dog and killed a dog. And the reason why Avedon told that story is he knew that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor loved their dogs more than they loved people. And he knew he would get a reaction out of them. And you're looking right now at the moment of shock when they hear about the dog being hit by the car. It's a very humane image. And this was the kind of image that Avedon would often strive to make. While he was certainly a humorist, and he would often make images that were very theatrical and performative, he also really wanted to get at the heart of people. And often that involved taking their masks off, removing their masks, so he could show something a bit deeper and a bit more interesting. This is the ultimate expression of that. This is a photograph of Marilyn Monroe. And he had photographed Marilyn Monroe for hours leading up to this. She was dancing for his camera, made an extraordinary series of pictures, and at the very end of the session was utterly exhausted and depleted. And Avedon made this picture at the end of that session, showing the Marilyn Monroe who is tired of being Marilyn Monroe. This image of Bob Dylan showing him in the street is a good lead-in to the present day that we are now finding ourselves in, the 1969 when the Chicago 7 picture was made. Avedon was increasingly called upon to photograph a new generation of stars and performers, the countercultural performers that were taking American arts in a new direction. And this image of Bob Dylan on the street in New York City near Central Park, facing the camera, is the beginning of his new style. This picture, also made in the mid-1960s, shows the importance of Avedon's own personal and political voice. Avedon was, while he in many ways was studiously apolitical and interested in politics only in the deeper sense that he was interested in power, he did have a politics, and it's important to acknowledge that. He was, in rough terms, sympathetic with the left wing of American life at the time. And in the early 1960s, he actually did a book called Nothing Personal, which was a look at a form of decay in American politics and a rising generation of young activists. If you haven't seen the book Nothing Personal, I highly recommend it. It's an extraordinary document at the time. Avedon, in many photographs, praised young activists of the American Civil Rights Movement. And in many other photographs, he showed an older generation of people in a way that was very often quite critical. And this fantastic group photograph of the generals of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the women who had denied their stage oh gosh, now all of a sudden I'm blanking on the name. Jaqueline, do you remember the name of the African-American opera singer who was not allowed to sing there?
Marian Anderson.
Was it Lena Horne?
No, it's not
No,
Lena
somebody
Horne.
just said Marian Anderson.
Marian
That's
Anderson.
correct. Thank you so much, Marian Anderson. If you ever wondered who it is that denied Marian Anderson the right to sing on stage, these are their faces. And in making this picture, Avedon was very determined to show them up, but he was also doing something quite interesting in formal terms that I think it's important to see at this time. He was learning how to make an image of a group, and therefore how to portray group identity as opposed to individual identity in a picture. And over the next several years, he became a master of the group portrait, which is a very difficult genre in art, and one that is not very well talked about or understood in art history. This image is a very powerful example of just how you can show the identity of a group as opposed to the individuals who you see in the picture. Group portraiture was really fascinating to Avedon, and we'll get more into this later. But I just want you to see that he was operating out of a rich tradition, even within photography, even if you don't consider painting, if you don't think about the great group portrait painters of the Dutch Golden Age, for example. Photographers very often were charged with photographing groups, like this terrific picture on the left by Irving Penn, made for Vogue magazine, or even more vernacular photographs like this terrific picture of the University of Michigan baseball team. Group identity is a big part of American life, and photographers are a big part of establishing our understanding of that identity. Now, I mentioned that Avedon was beginning to switch his style around this time, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. You can see here that Avedon is photographing with a view camera. This is a large format, 8x10-inch view camera. It's very heavy. It has to be mounted on a tripod in order to be used. And you see an image of Avedon posing with his camera and also making a photograph just 2 years later in 1971. You may remember that I just a few slides ago showed you a picture of Avedon holding a twin lens reflex. That's a smaller camera, a medium format camera that Avedon would typically use during the first part of his career. And he would hold it in front of his body, look down into the camera and compose his image through the lens. All of that changed at this time. As you can see, Richard Avedon now stands to the side of his camera. This camera is also extraordinary because it makes very, very large images, negatives that are this size, which then when enlarged into making a photograph could actually show incredible amounts of detail. And the most important thing is that now when Avedon made a picture, he wasn't behind his camera. He would stand to the side of it. And what does that mean? That means he would directly relate to the people he was photographing. He would engage them in conversation. He would charm them. He was a very charming man. And he also, was a little bit manipulative. And he would do things to get them to pose how he wanted them to pose. Some of it was subtle body movements. He would literally start by watching how they position themselves, and then he would mimic the position, holding his arm, for example, in the same place. And then after a while, he would start moving his arms or his hands or his body in a way that he wanted them to move. And he would then be able to subtly shift their pose to what he wanted to portray. And so he developed a whole style out of this, and it radically, radically changed what his images looked like. This is actually the first picture that he made in his new style. He had photographed with this camera before. He had used a white backdrop, a plain white backdrop before. He had even reproduced his photograph showing the edges of the frame, which you see here, those black edges, which are printed through clear negative film. He had done all of that, but he had not developed a style around it. And that's what he started to do in the summer of 1969. This is a self-portrait that he made in order to test out his new setup, his new camera, his lights, and the backdrop behind him. And you can see right away some of what's about to happen. First of all, there's no environment. There's nothing behind the sitter. There's nothing normal. There's no comfortable setting. There's no furniture. All you see is the person, the clothes they're wearing. If they're holding something, you might see that. Also, these pictures that he made from this point on very often cut off the body in particular and sometimes quite startling ways. The top of the head might be cut off, or the arm. In this case, the torso floats above the legs, which you do not see. And isolated against the backdrop, the people that he photographed became almost like butterflies pinned to a board in a natural history museum, displayed for the viewer. So that instead of the sense that the person is being photographed and with very little sense of the environment they're in, instead a relationship can start to forge between the sitter and the viewer. So that if you are at home, you've opened up the magazine, you're looking at a picture, you will now see the person looking right back out at you. And you can forge a relationship with the person who's being photographed. This style was something that Avedon wanted to adopt for a lot of complicated reasons, but the number one reason is that he was embarking on a new portraiture project. By the late 1960s, Avedon in some ways was trying to break free of the idea that he would only make portraits for magazines, that his portraits would only be made in order to illustrate a story about, say, the latest movie star performance in the Vogue magazine that he was working for at the time. Instead, he wanted to make personal portraiture projects, artistic projects, and make portraits toward a larger purpose. Again, it's by no means the first time that he's done this, but he is determined to do it even while he continues to make advertising photographs, fashion photographs, and so forth. And a great deal of the urgency that he felt in the late 1960s was the rising counterculture and the Vietnam War, and more importantly, public reaction against the Vietnam War. So in 1969, he started working on a project that he called Hard Times. And eventually it became published in a book called The 60s, many, many years later, for reasons that we don't need to go into now. But essentially, the project shifted and changed so many times that he ended up not really finding a satisfactory way of presenting it until many, many years later. But in the late 1960s, he was determined to represent the rising counterculture and the anti-war movement that was then changing the American conversation around politics and the Vietnam War. And everybody from a musician like Janis Joplin to the famous doctor who was telling people how they could better raise their babies and how they could better go through their pregnancies. Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was very well known at that time for his anti-war activism, and this very unusual photograph of him with his wife. And an image like this one of his own mentor, Alexei Brodovich, the graphic designer who had hired him at Harper's Bazaar many, many years earlier, and who was now on hard times himself. And if you were to get in very close in this photograph, and we can't do it here, you would see that Brodovich is actually crying in this image. The photographs that Avedon made at this time are very often misdescribed as being sterile and being very cold or chilly. In fact, I find, especially with the passage of time, that most of the photographs that he made in this new style were very emotional, but they're also very jarring. And they're destabilizing, and that's an important part of their radicalism. The most powerful photographs that Avedon was making at this time were actually a personal project apart from hard times, apart from his documentation of the counterculture and anti-war movement. He was beginning a series of photographs of his father in the last 5 years of his life. And the photographs that he made here eventually became a separate, quite small and quite extraordinary body of work about the way that his father aged and then ultimately died in 1974. But the pictures that he was most focused on at the time were these photographs. Here you see Bernadine Dorne. Some of you may remember Bernadine Dorne or have heard of her. Some of you may not, but she was the leader of the radical Weather Underground faction of the Students for a Democratic Society, which was part of the changing tenor of the counterculture at the time, the shift from peaceful activism rooted in the civil rights movement and its example of nonviolence to a much more aggressive, much less forgiving, much more potentially violent movement that arose in the early 1970s. And Bernadine Dorne, who you see here, is one of the leading figures of that shift. This picture shows Noam Chomsky, little known at the time, now very well known as the intellectual leader of the left wing in the United States, and still very active. And in the summer of 1969, Richard Avedon decided that he was going to go photograph the group of protesters who had been brought together by the commonality of being charged by the US government with traveling across state lines to incite riots and fomenting violence at the Chicago Democratic National Convention of 1968. Of course, that event, the riots that were kicked off by the police in Chicago in the summer of 1968, late summer, were a year earlier. But what happened in the aftermath of that and in the transition between the presidencies of LBJ, of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Richard Nixon, who took office around this period, was that in 1969, a decision was made to make an example of the activists who had been leading figures at the Democratic National Convention a year earlier. And so charges were filed, bringing together a total of 8 people, some of whom had never even met each other, and accusing them of conspiracy to disrupt the convention and to foment radical violence in the streets of Chicago. The person that you see here is one of the leading figures of that, of the what we now call the Chicago 7, what at the time was called the Chicago 8 or the Chicago Conspiracy Trial. And on 2 occasions, once in the early fall and then once in the later fall of 1969, Richard Avedon, like a lot of Americans, was following the news that was coming out of Chicago about the trial, and he actually traveled to Chicago to make photographs of the activists who were on trial for their very lives at that time. And here you see 2 pages from Richard Avedon's studio sittings register. These are the big red notebooks where Avedon's studio staff would write in his appointments, his travel schedule, and also the people that he was photographing. I love looking at these books because they tell us so much day by day about what Richard Avedon was doing. And you can very often see that in one day he might make, say, an advertising photograph from Monsanto, which you can see at the very far left of the image on the 23rd. And that very day fly to O'Hare Airport in Chicago and then stay at the Conrad Hilton Hotel, where he makes a series of photographs. Again, in early November, he goes back to Chicago to make pictures of the group of activists. And we're now going to look at those pictures. He was not only photographing. I want to point out that at this time he was collaborating with the great writer Doone Arbus, who is actually the daughter of a famous portrait photographer named Deanne Arbus. And Doone Arbus would interview the people that Avedon was photographing. His plans for this project, Hard Times, were that it would be both a series of portraits and also that you would be able to read the voices of the subjects, so that Abby Hoffman, in this case, would actually be speaking to the reader of what was envisioned as a book that would bring together all of these portraits. And so many of the original photographs that survive in the archive of the Richard Avedon Foundation are pictures that actually have mounted on the back a kind of typescript with excerpts from the interviews that were done. And they're quite extraordinary. I'm going to go through 4 of these portraits relatively slowly so that you can get a quick glimpse at what it is that's written there. And you can notice already that the interviews took place both in Avedon's September visit and during his November visit, when he photographed people in his room at the Palmer House in Chicago. And the interviews were quite wide-ranging. They were not just about the trial, they were also about how these young activists thought about their lives, how it is that they felt under the excruciating pressure of the trial. For those of you who have seen the movie on Netflix that I mentioned earlier, you already know what I mean. They were in the middle of a 5-month, what turned out to be a 5-month trial that was surreal because it was so obviously a political show trial, and they were being railroaded. They were quite terrified for their futures. Every day was a new experience of pressure and difficulty. And because it went on for so long, the optimism and the bravado and the resilience and rebellion that characterized their reactions at the beginning of the trial really started to wash away, and they became more and more fraught and urgently upset about what was happening to them. And a lot of that is evident in the typescript from this portrait of Jerry Rubin. This picture of Rennie Davis shows one of the, at that point, very unheralded activists, somebody very well known for being an organizer and a very skilled behind-the-scenes figure in the American anti-war movement. There were, of course, as I said, many different figures who were brought together under the umbrella of the Chicago 8. As I said, many of them didn't know each other. Some of them did work together. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were both founders of and members of the Yippies organization, the Youth International Party. Rennie Davis and Tom Hayden were working together at the leadership of the Students for a Democratic Society. They did not agree with each other about much at all. In fact, they fought constantly during the trial with one another because they had very different ideas about how the anti-war movement should be proceeding and how far to take things. They had very different beliefs about whether violence had any role in the protest movement at all, or whether things should be peaceful. And so they bickered constantly. This man, David Dellinger, who was one of the Chicago 7, was an elder figure of the anti-war movement. He was the organizer of the very successful mobilization march, the MOB, as it was often called at the time, which was a huge march on Washington, D.C. a year earlier than the Chicago Democratic National Convention. And Dave Dellinger was a veteran of earlier left-wing movements. He had been arrested and put in jail many times, and he was generationally completely different than the younger members of the Chicago 8. This picture, which is so uncharacteristic of Richard Avedon that we know that it must have been made for the people in the group and not for Richard Avedon's purposes. This picture was actually made on the same day as the famous group portrait that we'll be looking at next. And we know that because of the clothes they're wearing. It was made on November 5th, and this brings up a very important and interesting point. Well, interesting to me anyway. Maybe a lot of people won't care about this, but the photograph was very often misdated to Avedon's earlier visit in September. But when investigating things further, it was possible to figure out that this picture was made on an extremely important day. It was made on November 5th, and that is the date that the Chicago 8, which included another activist, one that you do not see here, a man named Bobby Seale, who was the leader at the time, or one of the 2 or 3 leaders at the top of the Black Panther Party. Bobby Seale on November 5th was actually removed from the trial. A mistrial was declared in his continuity for very complicated reasons, but terrible reasons. He was forced to be on trial without legal counsel for 2 months leading up to this. And he, in fact, for the previous 5 days of the trial, or 4 days, I guess, had been in courtroom, bound and gagged and sitting in a chair by order of the judge. And I am not kidding, and I am not making this up. And if you haven't seen the film yet, you will see a dramatization of it that is truly horrifying. Imagine day after day in an American courtroom seeing an activist bound and gagged and tied to a chair while on trial. Truly extraordinary. The prosecuting attorney at the time quite rightly saw that there was no chance of having of getting a prosecution of Bobby Seale at the time because the judge had ordered him to be bound and gagged. And so he moved for a mistrial, and Bobby Seale was separated from the Chicago 8, and therefore it now became the Chicago 7. And on that day, Richard Avedon finally could make a group portrait. And we suspect because of that, that he wanted to make that portrait all along. For both of his visits in September and November, he was actually making all kinds of pictures. He would essentially have the activists up to his hotel room. He photographed them alone in those single portraits that we saw. He photographed them with the families members and the friends that they brought with them. But it was all essentially leading up to what we're about to see next, and that is this. This is the famous group portrait that Richard Avedon made of the Chicago 7. It is one of a number of group portraits that he made at the time. And it is one of 4 multi-panel group portraits that he intended to be the definitive images of his new body of work about the counterculture in the 1960s. At one point, when he was planning an exhibition of this material, he told the curator that he envisioned an entire room filled with standing figures facing out of the wall, looking at and looming over the audience in the galleries, confronting them with their identities. And in the case of these group portraits, confronting the audience with their group identities. Groups, of course, during this time were a very important thing because there were a lot of protest and activist groups. And there were sometimes groups like this one, groups that were brought together through circumstances out of their control. The Chicago 7, of course, having been brought together because they were charged together with conspiracy. Now, as you look at this picture, you probably are noticing a number of things about it, and we're going to break those down right now by looking at each panel separately. So on the left-hand side, you see Lee Weiner, and you see John Freunds, and you also see a part of, a slice of, one side of Abby Hoffman. And so right away, you can start to see how Avedon is making his image work. Lee Weiner and John Freunds were academic radicals. They were bewildered to even be included in the trial, and ultimately they were acquitted of all charges. They were silent for most of the trial, but in this picture, they have a very important position because they are on the left and the right. And there's something very interesting that we can see here right away just by looking at their 2 figures. And that is that you can see the tops of their heads are cut off, and you can see that their feet are only partly visible. But you can also see quite a bit just by looking at their pose. They look nervous, they look anxious, they look under pressure, they look tense. and they even look a little bit bewildered. You can also see that they look different from each other, not just the clothes they're wearing, but the fact that they're presenting themselves in very different ways, and they're even looking in slightly different directions. Here you see the rest of Abbie Hoffman, and then next to him, Rennie Davis, and next to him, Jerry Rubin. And here you can start to see a little bit of the humor that's quite subtle, quite covert in this group portrait, because you might start noticing that, especially with Abbie Hoffman's face, that he looks a little bit like he's accused of something. And of course, he's been accused of something. They all have. They've been accused of something terrible. And there's a kind of an anxiety and pressure here that starts to look a little bit more like a police lineup than like a conventional portrait. These young men seem to be presenting themselves to a hidden viewer. And that hidden viewer is, of course, you, the person who's looking at the portrait, but you also are looking at them the way that a victim might look at perpetrators in a police lineup. And that was a subtle part of Avedon's humor, and something that he sometimes admitted to doing and sometimes was not too willing to admit to doing. But there are contemporaneous examples of him talking about it. And so we know that he was very, very aware of the idea of the police lineup when he made this picture. Look at the right side of Jerry Rubin, and you can see here that he's in a very different pose when you get to the right-hand panel. His hand is in his pocket here, and that was not the case in the previous picture. And Avedon really delighted in changing the frame as he moved from one panel to the next, and then putting them together so that you see the person at the edge actually moving over time. And there's this sense of an image made over time. And although it freezes a single instance, there is the suggestion of a narrative playing out from one image to the next, a larger story beyond the frame. Tom Hayden, who is kind of got his hands behind his back and he's looking right into the camera, he's a fantastic example of a person who believes that if he presents himself a certain way, that the person, the victim who's looking at the police lineup will certainly not look at him. And I love that aspect of the pose here. David Dellinger has a great deal more confidence, but he's barely inside the frame at all. And one wonders whether that's a reference to the fact that he fits only uncertainly into this group of much younger activists. Now, you might have noticed as well that there's a gap here between Jerry Rubin and Tom Hayden. And that gap is not an accident. It's a very deliberate suggestion of the very missing Bobby Seale, who just that day had been separated from the group, turning the Chicago 8 into the Chicago 7. That gap is the 8th figure. And we know that because Richard Avedon experimented in the image on the left with including Bobby Seale's wife and son in the picture, which is quite extraordinary. And you would otherwise not know about this, but it's in the working materials of the Richard Avedon Foundation's archive. The picture on the right is actually a fabrication. If you look down at the bottom near to the left of Tom Hayden's legs, you might see a thin little strip. That is actually a masking in of one of the images of Bobby Seale's son. And you can see that Avedon thought very seriously about including a kind of a generational representation of Bobby Seale and his humanity by including the next generation, the son who has been figuratively, symbolically orphaned by this trial. But in the end, he did not actually use this figure at all, and he left that white gap, that absent space. I mentioned earlier that this idea of the police lineup, but it's also important to know that Avedon was heavily influenced by mugshots. He was fascinated by the vernacular of the mugshot, and I've just put up two examples, a mugshot from a Massachusetts correctional facility on the right, and the kind of mugshot that many people in America saw for many years at their post offices, an FBI wanted poster. This kind of image where somebody presents themselves for identification is critical to understanding this new format. Avedon wanted the audience for his new pictures to ask itself a question. Where do you stand as a viewer vis-a-vis these people you're looking at? Are you with them? Are you against them? Do you suspect them? Where do you stand? And this was really, really important for him. So this style, which eventually became his mature style and one that he used and reiterated over the rest of his career, began with an idea. which is that the world is changing, society is changing. What side are you on? You, the viewer. But Avedon also was becoming more and more sophisticated as the project unfolded in terms of the kinds of images that he wanted to make of groups. And so he would make very strange images like this that actually showed people talking to one another. And he would photograph them in the same way with that disorienting white background, the complete absence of a normalizing context. And in an image like this, where you see two people talking, you're acutely aware that they look like they're standing in a living room and having a conversation, or in this case, the two lawyers who represented the Chicago Seven could be standing outside the courtroom, but they're not. They're standing against a void, against this white, empty, existential space. And that the pressure that this put on images like this was profound. I still think that these are among the most radical photographs ever made in American life. And Avedon was intent on creating a radical format for photographing the radical politics of the moment. The group portraits that he made at the time were often single panel, and I wanted to show you this as one example. This is some of the leading figures of the Young Lords Party, which was active in New York City at the time. This is a fantastic image where Avedon is showing the power of the edges of the frame to include and to exclude people, and the power of the frame to cut the figure and create a kind of tension at the edges. If you think again of a police lineup, you start to see the black edges of these frames as being almost like those height lines that you imagine when if you see a Hollywood movie and there's a scene of people against a police lineup backdrop, you'll always see these black lines behind them. They're being measured in an anthropological fashion. And therefore, they are being judged, and they are being segmented, and they are being divided by the state. So let's look at the picture again, and you can see all of these things happening. Some of it is really, really fascinating. When you look at the split figures now, you might notice more readily the two different hands and the three legs of Abby Hoffman. And that Jerry Rubin also has three hands, three arms, three legs, because he is split across the boundary here. Their faces charged with this kind of tense absence of emotion that actually implies emotion, that implies fear, that implies subjugation and disorientation. It's a very, very powerful picture. I mentioned and have already spoken a number of times about the photographic antecedents for work like this, but I wanted to give you a quick example of some of the other antecedents that led to this kind of image. In painterly terms, Avedon was absolutely obsessed with the group portraits of the Netherlandish Golden Age, the period in the late 16th century into the 17th century, where portraits were made of groups, militias, civic groups of various kinds. And there was an entire genre that developed throughout the Netherlands, not only in Amsterdam, where this fantastic militia portrait was made, but in many towns and cities throughout the Netherlands. And the paintings of that time, I think, are still just some of the most extraordinary portraits ever made. Even though we do not know who these people are, unless you do the research, you would have a little sense of their history. There is so much that you can tell about their bodies, about their lives, and about their group identity in the militia that you see here. That style and all of the different kinds of codes of representation that were created by those portrait painters in the Dutch Golden Age were really critical in framing out how group portraits were made in photography. So that here you can see this is just actually a detail of a Canadian military group portrait from the World War I era. You can see that there is a ranking and a kind of a status organization of people, so that this core of nurses behind the person we imagine to be the commanding officer, and the way that people are arrayed by rank, I mean, you can tell this without even having it said to you, is adopted from paintings like this, where people are arrayed by their rank and by the way that they relate to each other in the militia, so that people from the foreground and in the center tend to be the most powerful. People in the background, hidden away, parts of their body hidden, are a big indication, a large clue that they were less important. And Avedon did not stop with this format, and he did not stop thinking about the pictorial possibilities, so that when he made what is often considered the pendant portrait in a pair of mural portraits to stand opposite the Chicago 7 picture, he photographed the Mission Council in Vietnam. These are the civilian and military figures who planned and carried out the war in Vietnam. He made this picture a year and a half after making the Chicago 7 photograph. He actually went to Saigon in Vietnam to make the photograph. And he arrayed, as in the portraits that we just saw, the military portraits painted and photographed, he arrayed the people in this picture by order of their power. The two at the center, who are Creighton Abrams and Ellsworth Bunker, are respectively the military and diplomatic leaders of the Vietnam War in the United States. I should say the United States carrying out of the Vietnam War. And once again, you can see a white gap over to the right here. And that again is a missing figure. Here it is the head of the CIA station in Vietnam who showed up for the setting or for the sitting, and then quietly excused himself because he did not want to be photographed. And Avedon, having had his experience of creating a white space for Bobby Seale, created a white space for Ted Shackley, the head of the CIA in Vietnam. Eventually, these photographs would be shown together, but that didn't happen until 1975. And when they were shown together, they were right opposite each other, so that the young activists of the Chicago 7 were facing across the room the people who carried out the war in Vietnam. And even in 1975, when Avedon showed those pictures, the US was still actually in Vietnam. But this picture, which shows Richard Avedon at the very first showing of the Chicago 7 portraits by themselves, showed them in the context of the American anti-war movement. And you can see that in this image. Here is Richard Avedon in Minneapolis at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts in 1970, in July 1970, less than a year after he made the photographs. And he decided to put the Chicago 7 pictures in his show at the last gallery, ending a survey of his work to that date. He wanted to end the show with his most recent photographs, and he felt very strongly about talking in this work about the Chicago 7. He felt that it was really important that people understand what was happening at that moment outside the doors of the museum. And I'd like to read for you a brief statement that he said to an interviewer at the time. Part of my new project brought me to Chicago during the conspiracy trial, and I did many portraits there of the 7 men being tried for conspiracy. I consider the 7 defendants to be heroic men, and that they're doing for all of us what we should be doing, or should have done a long time ago. These men are putting their lives on the line. They work in different ways. It's easy to group them as one, but they're not. They believe in very different things, and they are very different men. But they're all working towards a common goal, and that goal is to make the country America. I'm ashamed myself, with my family, my son, that I wasn't more active in the last 25 years in trying not to hand my son this mess. And I don't think I did enough. I don't think any of us did enough. I think we just had a lot of good times on someone else's trouble. I'm going to show you now what these pictures look like in a video or a film that was shot at the time by Richard Avedon's studio assistants of what it was like in that room as people for the first time saw the big portrait, the group portrait, and also these large individual portraits of the Chicago 7 at that very moment in 1970. The trial was just over. The defendants were just sentenced, and it was still news. And already it was history. Thank you all very much for listening. I'm very, very happy to have had this opportunity to talk to you today. And I really want to thank the organizers of today's talk, in particular, Jaqueline. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here.
Thank you, Paul. I have a question for you. How did Richard get involved with the Chicago 7 series? Did someone contact him? Did it just interest him at the time?
It interested him at the time. He, while working with his collaborator, Dune Arbus, put together a list, which, changed over the subsequent months, a list of all of the people in the counterculture that he wanted to photograph and interview. And, early on in that list was the Chicago 7, because there were, of course, innumerable news stories about this trial. And even before the trial started, the activists who were prominent in the anti-war movement really suspected that it was a political railroading, that it was not a serious criminal trial, but rather an attempt on the part of the government to embarrass the movement and to take power away from the anti-war movement. And I think Avedon was fascinated by that. But as he made the photographs, I think his motivation for investing in the portrait, the group portrait, changed. And that's because he was talking to these activists and learning the pressures that they were under and getting a sense of who they were as people and as a group. So I think his interest was immediate, but it evolved just by making the pictures during September and November.
When did he release the pictures initially?
His very first showing of them, very first publication of them was in July 1970 in that exhibition in Minneapolis. And interestingly enough, he didn't really know that he was going to include them in that show until the very last minute. He had been planning the exhibition for some time with absolutely no desire to use any new pictures. And so it was a last minute decision, very, very quickly undertaken. The prints were made very fast, and he showed them in a really different way than the rest of the show. You probably saw in the film there that they were draped down the wall. They were not framed or mounted except to canvas. They were very rough looking. They had been rolled up to be shipped from New York to Minneapolis. So it was a rushed decision. It was a critically important decision because it turned out that at that exhibition, a great deal of young activists and teenagers in Minneapolis came to the show because of those pictures. And on the night of the opening, in fact, there were chants and political sloganeering in the room, and one person, a singer, started singing American patriotic songs in the room, and people joined in a sing-along. So it was a very powerful first showing of the pictures.
So what was you said it was very powerful with the younger generation. Was there any pushback from anybody in politics?
I don't have a sense that there was pushback from politicians. I think, a lot of times we imagine that politicians pay more attention to the arts than I think they actually do. And as somebody who worked as a curator in Washington, D.C. for many years, I can tell you that was a source of never-ending frustration to me. We could just never get the people from Capitol Hill to come to our exhibitions at the Corcoran. But I think that, just because there's no indication in the news articles that I saw that politicians were upset by the pictures doesn't mean that they wouldn't have been upset. I think, however, there is evidence of something that is, for me, just as meaningful, and that is that well-to-do people, and in particular, the trustees of the museum and the wealthy supporters of the museum, many of them were actually quite upset about the pictures. And there was tremendous tension between Avedon and the director of the museum in the lead up to the opening, because although the director was totally fine with the pictures being shown, he argued about every different detail of that, from the text that accompanied the pictures to Avedon wanted the opening to be a fundraiser to support the anti-war movement, and the director adamantly refused that. And there was some sense that Board of Trustees members were very, very upset to walk into their museum and to see these portraits.
That is, absolutely amazing. Such a dichotomy between, a younger generation, I should say, with the anti-war movement, and the older guard not even wanting to see it in their museum. So it's, that in effect is really, it's just fascinating. I'm wondering what Avedon would have said about, the two I mean, I'm sure both of them were in the openings. You know, you had a younger generation there and an older generation hanging out in the same, you know, cocktail function. I mean, it must have, you know, made for fascinating conversation.
Oh,
Anyway,
it did.
yeah.
It was, I gotta tell you, Avedon really pushed that. He knew that they were upset when he went. So there's this amazing story that he drove around Minneapolis picking up teenagers and counterculture people and bringing them to, he brought them to the opening without invitations. So that there were a number of young activists present. And he did that on purpose as a provocation to the VIPs that were invited. He was very clever.
That sounds like it. So unfortunately, we are out of time today. I wish we could stay on longer. I have a million questions to ask you, but I'll do it offline. So thank you so much for coming with us today. I mean, it's really been a pleasure, and the images are just unbelievable. It's so timely right now with this, to have this conversation. It really, really is. Unfortunately, it seems like we're almost back to full circle, but you know, hopefully this documentary and his work is obviously persevering. And they made this documentary right now, you know, so it's, I know Aaron Sorkin was saying that it was almost in the works for 14 years, this documentary, but now they, you know, just had to get it out, which is, it's very powerful.
It really is. Couldn't have come at a more appropriate time.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for coming. I do want to thank, as always, Merle and Dan Weiss for supporting our program. And Paul, what is the website of the Ryerson Image Center if somebody wants to look into what you're up to now?
Sure, it's Ryerson Image Center, all one word, .ca for Canada, not .com for com. And I also encourage people to go to the Richard Avedon Foundation website where you can see a lot more of his work. But yes, we would be very happy to have you visit. And these days, it's the only way we're being visited is on our website. So hopefully we'll all be past this pandemic soon. And if you're ever in Toronto, you can come visit us in person.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks again, Paul. I really appreciate it. And to everybody joining us today, thank you so much. And we'll see you soon. Stay tuned. Thanks again, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you. Take care.